It's an interesting conversation, and I'm going to sort of take it back to the other end of the spectrum now. The reality of the superannuation involvement is, as characterised here, everything needs to be sort of set before we can move confidently into that space. And it's not an easy thing to do, and issues of risk profile or otherwise. One of the things that's barely been touched on today, and we're going to talk about it very heavily on Thursday when we talk about the regulatory sort of landscape, is this conflation of the words scams and this industry, and the laziness with which the language is carried across. When I talk about scams, I talk about things that are illegal. I talk about people's attempts to defraud others. When the language of scams is used in the blockchain, cryptocurrency, digital asset space, it just means I don't like the outcome of that investment. That's what it means more often than not. If it's on the way up, we're all geniuses. If it's on the way down, it's a scam. Someone needs to help me. That language has been perpetuated by others in the industry. I mean, we casually use that language as well. So, people talk about, it seems like a scam, seems like a rug pull. It doesn't help. And the reality of the way regulators use that language as well, when they say scams, they usually mean something specific, but no one can tell the difference because they say the same thing we do. It's the same four-letter word. And when we say scam and they say scam, everything sort of melds into one or the other. So when it comes to the superannuation fund, I think it's important to say processes. What happens here? What are we identifying as best practice for businesses? Which brings me to the next conversation with Christian from Monoova. Christian from Monoova. I've just lost my train of thought for a second. With Christian, what he does is he makes money move. That's the whole point of this sort of presentation. The thing that we're finding is businesses like Christian's are the only reason this industry is still alive. The reality is a lot of businesses did not support this. A lot of banks didn't support this. Payment providers didn't support this. This was the grease that kept the wheel spinning. And so there needs to be greater recognition that there were businesses that were willing to step up and do that whilst everybody else wasn't there. And we'll come on to a panel after this where we talk about payments as well and how things are moving. There are certain businesses, and this is part of the afternoon's narrative. Some people believed enough to take a risk commercially. Some people believed enough to have the knocking of the door of the regulators that was never ending. We don't know this, we don't like this, we want you to have a look at it. And they survived because they were people building better mousetraps. And with that sort of introduction, Christian, I'll invite you onto the stage and you can talk about how we make money move. Thank you.
It's an amazing introduction. Like balloons and confetti coming down immediately. I'm going to the red microphone. Work. All right, thank you. Yes, my name is Christian. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Monoova. Monoova is a in April 2017, and now it works, and have been with the industry ever since. I would hazard a guess that we're probably serving if not a majority, at least a very large portion of fiat currency on and off ramping in Australia. And I'm very, very happy to do so. Lots of the voluntary initiatives early on, before there was Australian regulation to cover this industry, also made it much easier for us to have serious conversations, both with the digital currency space, which was very early and very young in Australia, and at the same time with our banking partners and regulators and others, because there was the, what's it called? Sort of voluntary ADCA, I think it was called voluntary ADCA status and a lot of other things. Anyway, we have a tagline, which is Make Money Move, which Steve and his team at Blockchain Australia turned into an exciting title, and then they gave me 10 minutes to talk about it. So, which is another compliment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this opportunity to really lead into the panel discussion that we're having later on with a few of us. So it will be a very, very high level. Maybe one more thing to boost credentials for sort of sense of scale. In the 5 years that we've been around, we've moved something like $42 billion, majority of that in the last 7 months. So there is still a lot happening, values going up and down, but there is still a lot of participation in this industry, and we've been very, very proud to be part of it. I'm proud to have our name down there somewhere as a sponsor. All right, so if this is a mainstream moment, then the vast majority of people should be interested more in the making money move rather than the web2 and web3 parts. Because making money move is sort of the use case, like what are we hoping to achieve? And the web2 or web3 is just a technology aspect of how do you solve for something, how do you solve for that use case? Whether ultimately it should be web1 or web50 is sort of more for our builders to find out what is a good outcome. So let's start with a use case. I've given a talk a few times, which some of you might have heard, which is about sort of the deep history of payments technology. And I start 40,000 years ago, which is when we have the earliest evidence of a transaction taking place. And I go 40,000 years into the future, we end up in today, and then I make a tiny, tiny sort of extrapolation into another 10 years or so in 2030. And one thing that you can say, without going through all of that information, is that it's a very, very clear consensus and a conclusion of 40,000 years of history, which is that at every point, customers, consumers, users of payments have wanted convenience and ease as a number one, and possibly as a number two, optionality. And that might seem like a foregone conclusion, but it could have been privacy, for instance. It could have been that actually for 40,000 years, we wanted to make our payments more and more private, less and less open to others. But that's not the case. Often we go the other way. We exchange privacy for ease. So if that's what we're going to do, well, to what extent does moving from Web 2 to Web 3 solve that? How does it make payments easier? How does it make payments more, give us more broader options in terms of how we pay for things? And I'm going to, in true bullet point style here, just mention 3 things that might come up in the next presentation. I'm going to check my time here. Yes, halfway through, I'm good. The first is the obvious one, which is just access. So in a Web 2 world, and I'm going to use Web 2 and 3 very broadly here because there are at least as many definitions of these 2 terms as there are people in this room, and probably you square it and you end up in Metcalfe's law again. If we think of Web 2 as centralized and Web 3 as decentralized, possibly using blockchain to achieve that, well then it's not strange that in a centralized system there will be very heavy vested interest in controlling infrastructure that, rightly or wrongly, has been built by a small number of actors. And frankly, if I were them, I'd want the same thing. But that also means control of access becomes very concentrated in the hands of a few. And Stephen was talking about the sort of debanking and who gives you access, in our case, to payment rails. And there really aren't that many who can do that. In a Web3 world, access is not an issue. It might be information around how to use it, but it's there if you're looking closely enough. That's number one. We'll talk more about that later, I'm sure. The second one is probably slightly more far-fetched, and that's sort of currency optimization. So at the moment, the single most sort of decisive factor in what currency you're using when you're transacting is your location. It's sort of a really unintended consequence of the Treaty of Westphalen in 1648. But that's what determines that when you stand somewhere and you pay, they're going to assume it's going to be Australian dollars because you are in Australia. It's not a particularly exciting reason to pay with that currency rather than another one. Like, what if instead of just my location, it's the relationship I have with the merchant, say, or it's the appreciation or depreciation of that particular currency at a particular point in time? What if my wallet has lots of different currencies, some of which are depreciating at the moment? I'd love to get rid of them right now. So that in itself is driving what means I'm using to transact. That is an absolute impossibility in a Web 2 world, where again, you have single points of access, and those single points of access set up for single types of currencies in this case. But if we think of a world where we talked a lot about communities today, where every community more or less is starting to have its own currency, whether it's Web 2 type World of Warcraft communities or Web 3 type NFTs communities, and I want to trade in this particular instance with this currency because I have some kind of algorithm that realizes this one is losing 5% in value right now, get rid of it, or this is a depreciating asset, I'm happy to spend a depreciating currency to buy it. Like, I shouldn't use the same currency to buy cucumber as I'm buying improvements for the house. They're very different types of transactions, yet just because I'm in Australia, I'm using the same one. Third one is the Web 3 version of something that we all come to really associate with Web 2, which is the monetization of data. So in a Web 2 world of monetization of data, you have data that you can sell to advertisers, and therefore you have 95% of the market, whatever you heard in search, and the more market share you have, the more market share you get, the more money, etc. Now, I think not often spoken about equivalent in a Web 3 world is the datification of money. So rather than the monetization of data, it goes the other way around. And of course, there will be plenty of overlap between those two. But if we also don't have access in a payments world to use a number of different payment rails, which are not controlled in a centralized way the way they currently are, and we can use the different types of currencies we want to use for it, etc., then we are creating data. We're creating data that, with CDR and a few other policies in place, is ours to share or not to share. We are creating data out of transactions, which in turn probably can be monetized later on, so you go full circle. And this is probably my end point then. In a web3 world, the difference between data and money, or data and value, becomes harder and harder to tell. And it becomes less and less relevant to tell as well. If we can move money and information at the same speed, which is quite a new thing. I mean, in Australia, MPP launched, 2018? That's 4 years ago. Before that, we would never have thought of them as even remotely similar, because one thing I could send immediately on WhatsApp and it cost me nothing and it got there immediately. The other one, I told you about in the WhatsApp, please look out for this in the following few days. I mean, it felt very, very different, like they're not the same thing. Nowadays, even just with MPP being up and running, Pay2 coming, etc., that has changed. There's no reason why information and value shouldn't travel at the same pace. And if they travel at the same pace and increasingly start looking the same, we will need the same policies, privacy policies and custodial policies, things that say, how do you safeguard someone's money and how do you safeguard someone's information, are all going to coalesce. And with those high-level introductions, I am just on time. Look at that.
Christian, to take a seat as we get the rest of the panel to come up. I like listening to podcasts at 1.8 speed, Christian. That was a podcast at 1.8 speed. That was not a 10-minute conversation. That was a 20-minute presentation. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot.